Section 24 of the Book of the Ancient Greeks. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by William Jones, Bonita Springs, Florida. The Book of the Ancient Greeks by Dorothy Mills. Part 2, Chapter 18a, Alexander the Great. Part 1, Philip of Macedon. History is the story of the way in which man has learned how to live, and in learning this, man has come from time to periods of great change, periods when the old order of things has changed, passing into the new. These times are always very difficult for those who live in them, for so much of the old seems to be undergoing destruction that the building of the new is not noticed, for those who destroy generally make more noise than those who build. Greece was living through one of these periods of change when Philip became king of Macedon. Not very much is known about the early Macedonians. They were partly barbarian and partly Greek, and when they first appear in history were very disunited. In the plains dwelt a number of tribes who were said to be of Greek origin. They were closely bound to the king, and the chief of them were known as his companions. Scattered about the hills were numerous tribes, more barbarous than the Greek, who looked on the king of Macedonia as their overlord, but who were a constant source of danger to him, as they were frequently struggling for independence. When a weak king ruled, the story of Macedonia became that of petty warfare with these hill tribes. But strong kings were always trying to unite these warring elements into a nation. In 359 B.C., Philip became king of Macedonia. He had spent 3 years in Thebes, where he had seen the transformation that the military genius of Epaminondas had effected in the Theban army, and now at the age of 24 he found himself ruler of Macedonia. But his inheritance was one that might have daunted the stoutest heart. He had no allies and no money. Enemies surrounded him on all sides, and there was no unity in his kingdom. But he had youth, a few faithful friends, unbounded ambition, and a body fit to endure any hardships. Philip never asked anything of his soldiers that he was not ready to do himself, yet he was not a man whom they loved, and he inspired fear rather than affection. Philip had 3 definite aims in his policy: to create a standing army, one that would be ready to march and fight at all times, in winter as well as summer, to unite all Macedonia into a real kingdom, and then to unite all Greece under his rule. Having done that, he intended to march into Asia against the Persian king. Philip created his army, he subdued and united Macedonia, and then he was ready to turn to Greece. Athens, Sparta, and Thebes were now all weak. The power of the city-state was passing away, and was to yield in time to the new idea of national unity, but it was not to yield without a conflict. The struggle between Philip and the Greek states was more than a struggle between a strong state and several weak ones. It was a conflict of ideas. On the one side was Athens and the states who sided with her, the last representatives of the independent city-state who still jealously guarded their political freedom. On the other side was Philip, who represented this new idea of national unity. He determined to subdue most of Greece by force, but he would have liked Athens to yield to him of her own free will. The power of her fleet and her armies had been broken, but her thought, her art, and her culture remained. Could Philip have been received by Athens with goodwill and been recognized by her as the leader of all Greece? He would have held it of greater importance than any military victory. He wrote letters to her statesmen, sent special envoys to Athens to plead his cause. He tried to prove to her that her fears of him were groundless, and he treated the very soil of Attica as if it were sacred. It is a striking picture. Philip the warrior at the head of a powerful army, lowering his sword before the politically weak little state because of the might of her spirit. And that spirit was not dead. One more flash of the old Athenian independence flamed out in the defiance she hurled at Philip. Philip advanced. He seized and held Thermopylae, the gateway into Greece. He upheld the rights of Delphi against a neighboring state and was recognized by the oracle as the defender of Apollo. Then he marched into Boeotia, where Athens and Thebes made a last tremendous stand against him. In 338 B.C., one of the decisive battles of the world was fought at Chaeronea. On one side was an army of the last representatives of the old city-state, a confused array of men, some of them citizen soldiers serving without pay, some of them hired mercenaries, and on the other side the first great army of one united nation. The battle was fought on a hot summer's day, and it was fierce and long. But at length the Greek gave way, and Philip was victorious. He had little mercy for Thebes, and she drank the cup of bitterness to the dregs. Some of her leaders were banished, others were put to death. A Macedonian garrison was placed in the city, and all Theban lands were confiscated. Athens was treated with greater mercy. On the day of the victory over her, Philip did not laugh at table or mix any amusements with the entertainment. He had no chaplets or perfumes, and as far as was in his power, he conquered in such a way that nobody might think of him as a conqueror. And neither did he call himself the king, but the general of Greece. To the Athenians, who had been his bitterest enemies, he sent back their prisoners without ransom, and restored the bodies of those that were slain in battle for burial. And he sent Alexander, his son, to make peace and an alliance with them. Underlying all his ambition, all his reliance on military power, was yet the feeling, partly unconscious, yet there, that after all the things of the spirit were greater than those of pomp and power, and he longed for recognition from Athens. But Athens, though forced to recognize his supremacy, never accepted him willingly. Philip's next move was to organize an expedition into Asia in order to crush the power of Persia. And as such an expedition would take Philip out of Greece, most of the Greek states agreed to join in. But he first returned to Macedonia, where enemies were always to be found stirring up hostility to him. A royal marriage gave a good excuse for a great public festivity, and a procession was planned in which Philip, robed in white, was to walk in state. It must have been a moment of great triumph. His ambitions were fulfilled. The Macedonian army was the greatest in the world. He had united the hostile elements of his kingdom and made them a nation. He had conquered Greece and had been recognized as the chief general of all the Greek armies, and now he was about to set forth to conquer Persia. He was still young, and there seemed nothing to prevent the fulfillment of every further ambition. But suddenly, as the stately procession moved forward, a man darted out from the crowd of spectators, buried his dagger deep in the heart of the king, and Philip fell dead. He was succeeded by his son Alexander, who, in a speech to the Macedonians, summed up the achievements of his father. He said to them, "My father found you, vagabond and poor, most of you clad only in skins, tending a few sheep on the mountainsides, and to protect them you had to fight against the border tribes, often with small success. Instead of the skins, my father gave you cloaks to wear, and he led you down from the hills into the plains and made you the equal in battle of the neighboring barbarians, so that your safety depended no longer upon the inaccessibility of your mountain strongholds, but on your own valor. He taught you to live in cities, and he gave you good laws and customs, and instead of being the slaves and subjects of those barbarians, by whom you and your possessions had long since been harried, he made you lords over them. He also added the greater part of Thrace to Macedonia, and by seizing the most conveniently situated places on the sea coast, he threw open your country to commerce. He made it possible for you to work your mines in safety. He made you rulers over the Thessalonians, of whom you had formerly been in mortal fear, and by humbling the Phocians, he gave you, instead of a narrow and difficult road into Greece, a broad and easy one. To such a degree did he humble the Athenians and Thebans, who had ever been ready to fall upon Macedonia, that instead of your paying tribute to the former and being vassals to the latter, both states turned to us for protection. He marched into the Peloponnesus, and after setting affairs there in order, he was publicly declared commander-in-chief of the whole of Greece in the expedition against the Persians. And he considered this great distinction not as personal honor to himself, but as a glory for Macedonia. The new king was only 20 years old. It seemed as if his father had been cut off at the height of his career, and that his death would mean nothing but disaster to the power of Macedonia. But what seems like a tragedy and the failure of human hopes is sometimes the door through which an individual or a nation passes to greater things. Philip had done his work. He was a great soldier and had made great conquests, but he inspired no love, and he lacked the imagination which would have made him see with the eyes of the conquered, and so rule them that they would have become real parts of a mighty whole. His son was young, but he had this gift, and so the tragedy of his father's death was beginning of new and greater opportunities for him, and the door through which Greece was to pass from the old order into the new. Part 2. Demosthenes. Although forced to acknowledge the political supremacy of Philip, Athens had never given him the real homage he so greatly deserved, that of the spirit. And that she persisted in her refusal was largely due to the orator Demosthenes. Politically, Athens was now weak, and her constant wars were a great strain on all their resources. But at this time, most of her fighting was done at a distance from Athens by hired mercenaries. A great change had come over her since the days of Marathon and Salamis. No longer was it the pride of the Athenians that her citizens themselves defended her, and though the young men liked to boast that their forefathers had fought at Marathon, they preferred a more pleasure-loving life than was possible in a camp, and so they paid other men to go out and fight for them. Demosthenes fought against the spirit, and when Philip made advances to Athens and tried to conclude an alliance with her, Demosthenes made speech after speech against such a policy, imploring the people not to make terms with the stranger, but to make ready for war and to give their own lives on the battlefield instead of paying others to die for them. Demosthenes had been a delicate child, very shy, with stammering in his speech. He grew up, however, with a passion for oratory, and he would go to hear the noted orators of his time and listen to every word they said, going home afterward to practice the art of speaking himself. The first time he spoke in public, he met with discouragement, for his style was awkward, his voice was weak, and he stammered. He determined, however, that he would overcome all these obstacles, and he built himself a place to study in underground, and hither he would come constantly every day to form his action and to exercise his voice, and here he would continue, oftentimes without intermission, 2 or 3 months together, shaving 1/2 of his head, that so for shame he might not go abroad, though he desired it ever so much. It was known that Demosthenes worked very hard over his speeches, and that he never spoke in the assembly unless he had thought over the subject and prepared what he intended to say. It became a matter of joke in Athens that instead of depending upon inspiration, his speeches smelt of the lamp. In his old age, Demosthenes told some of his friends how he had overcome his defects in speech. His inarticulate and stammering pronunciation he overcame and rendered more distinct by speaking with pebbles in his mouth. His voice he disciplined by declaiming and reciting speeches or verses when he was out of breath, while running or going up steep places, and that in his house he had a large looking-glass before which he would stand and go through his exercises. To cure a habit he had of raising his left shoulder while speaking, he suspended a naked sword over it whenever he practiced, and he would stand on the seashore during a storm to declaim, so that he might accustom himself to the uproar in a public assembly. Demosthenes has been called the greatest of orators. Opinions have differed since as to whether his policy was the wisest for Athens to follow at that moment, but every word he uttered was inspired by a passionate love for Athens, and he at all times entreated the Athenians to be true to their own great spirit and their ancient patriotism. Never to this day, he said on one occasion, has this people been eager for the acquisition of money, but for honor it has been eager as for nothing else in the world. It is a sign of this that when Athens had money in greater abundance than any other Hellenic people, she spent it all in the cause of honor. Her citizens contributed from their private resources, and she never shrank from danger when glory was to be won. Therefore she has those eternal and abiding possessions, the memory of her actions and the beauty of her offerings, dedicated in honor of them. The porticos which you see, the Parthenon, the colonnades, and the dockyards. The speeches of Demosthenes against the policy of making friends with Philip are known as the Philippics, a word which has become part of later language, and in the greatest of these he shows the Athenians how their lowered ideals have permitted political corruption and were leading them to destruction. Well, what is the cause of these things? He asked, for as it was not without reason that the Hellenes in old days were so prompt for freedom, so it is not without cause or reason that they are now so prompt to be slaves. There was a spirit, men of Athens, a spirit in the mind of the people in those days which is absent today, the spirit which vanquished the wealth of Persia, which led Hellas in the path of freedom, and never gave way in face of battle by sea or land, a spirit whose extinction today has brought universal ruin and turned Hellas upside down. And what was this spirit? It was nothing subtle or clever. It meant that those who took money from those who aimed at domination or the ruin of Hellas were execrated by all. Where are such sentiments now? They have been sold in the market and are gone. In burning words, Demosthenes pleaded with the Athenians to fight themselves with their old spirit for their freedom. I wonder that you, men of Athens, who once raised your hand against Sparta in defense of the rights of the Hellenes, who spent your own fortunes in war contributions, and who always bore the brunt of the dangers of the campaign, that you, I say, are now shrinking from marching, and hesitating to make any contribution to save your own possessions. This is our own personal and immediate duty, and I say that you must contribute funds, and you must go on service in person with a good will. You must get rid of all excuses and all deficiencies on your own part. You cannot examine mercilessly the actions of others unless you yourselves have done all that your duty requires. Demosthenes possessed the power of appealing to both the reason and the emotions of his hearers, and in the end Athens followed his advice. But it resulted in disaster. Those who had opposed Demosthenes, especially the statesman Aeschines, turned upon him in anger and accused him of sacrificing the lives of young men and of spending their treasure for nothing. Athens had followed his advice and had been beaten, and now Philip was her master. As Aeschines and his opponents had been laying such stress on the consequences of his policy, Demosthenes defended himself in what was perhaps the greatest of his speeches. In one part of it, he warned the Athenians that what he had to say might startle them, but let no one, he said, in the name of heaven be amazed at the length to which I go, but give a kindly consideration to what I say, even if what was to come was plain to all beforehand, even if all foreknew it, even if you, Aeschines, had not been trying with a loud voice in warning and protestation, you who uttered not so much as a sound, even then, I say, it was not right for the city to abandon her course. If she had any regard for her fame, or for our forefathers, or for the ages to come. As it is, she is thought, no doubt, to have failed to secure her object, as happens to all alike whenever good wills it. But then, by abandoning in favor of Philip her claim to take the lead of others, she must have incurred the blame of having betrayed them all. Had she surrendered without a struggle those claims in defense of which our forefathers faced every imaginable peril, who would not have cast scorn upon you, Aeschines? Upon you, I say, not, I trust, upon Athens, nor upon me. In God's name, with what faces should we have looked upon those who came to visit the city, if events had not come around to the same conclusion as they now have? If Philip had been chosen as commander and lord of all, and we stood apart while others carried on the struggle to prevent these things, and that although the city had never yet in time past preferred an inglorious security to the hazardous vindication of a noble cause, what Hellene, what foreigner does not know that the Thebans and the Spartans, who were powerful still earlier, and the Persian king would all greatly and gladly have allowed Athens to take and keep all that was her own, if she would do the bidding of others and let another take the first place in Hellas. But this was not, it appears, the tradition of the Athenians. It was not tolerable, it was not in their nature. From the beginning of time, no one had ever yet succeeded in persuading the city to throw in her lot with those who were strong but unrighteous in their dealings, and to enjoy the security of servitude. Throughout all time, she has maintained her perilous struggles for preeminence, honor, and glory. and this policy you look upon as so lofty, so proper to your own national character, that of your fathers also, it is those who have acted thus that you praise most highly. And naturally, for those who would not admire the courage of those men, who did not fear to leave their land and their city, and to embark upon their ships, that they might not do the bidding of another, who chose for their general Themistocles, who had counseled them thus, and stoned Cercelius to death, when he gave them his voice for submission to a master's orders, and not him alone. For your wives stoned his wife also to death. For the Athenians of that day did not look for an orator or a general who would enable them to live in happy servitude. They cared not to live at all unless they might live in freedom. For every one of them felt that he had come into being not for his father and his mother alone, but also for his country. And wherein lies the difference? He who thinks he was born for his parents alone awaits the death which destiny assigns him in the course of nature. But he who thinks that he was born for his country also will be willing to die that he may not see her in bondage, and look upon the outrages and indignities that he must needs bear in a city that is in bondage, as more to be dreaded than death. Now, if I were attempting to argue that I had induced you to show a spirit worthy of your forefathers, there is not a man who might not rebuke me with good reason. But in fact, I am declaring that such principles as these are your own. I am showing that before my time the city displayed this spirit, though I claim that I too have had some share, as your servant, in carrying out your policy in detail. But in denouncing policy as a whole, in bidding you to be harsh with me, as one who has brought terrors and dangers upon the city, the prosecutor, in his eagerness to deprive me of my distinction at the present moment, is trying to rob you of praises that will last throughout all time. For if you condemn the defendant on the ground that my policy was not for the best, men will think that your own judgment has been wrong, and that it was not through the unkindness of fortune that you suffered what befell you. But it cannot be that you were wrong, men of Athens, when you took upon you the struggle for freedom and deliverance. No. By those who at Marathon bore the brunt of the peril, our forefathers. No, by those who at Plataea drew up their battle line, by those who at Salamis, by those who went off Artemisium, fought the fight at sea, by the many who lie in the sepulchres where the people laid them, brave men, all alike deemed worthy by their country. Aeschines, of the same honor and the same obsequies, not the successful or the victorious alone. And she acted justly, for all these have done that which it was the duty of brave men to do. But their fortune has been that which heaven assigned to each. End of section 24.